Attorney Rebecca Lane was among the first to meet Ethan Reed. Their introduction came through the head of G. Connecty's administrative offices. At first glance, the towering and undeniably attractive executive stirred something in Rebecca that she struggled to keep in check. She prided herself on maintaining professionalism, no matter how magnetic the situation, and she wasn't the type to swoon over a man or engage in obvious flirtation. She knew she would be working with him, and it was essential to remain composed. Ethan Reed had recently taken over as the chief of the real estate tax division at GESKC, while Rebecca served as a senior associate attorney in the corporate counsel's office. Though the real property group functioned separately, it still operated under the broader GESKC umbrella. Ethan wasn't Rebecca's boss, nor did he technically outrank her within the corporate hierarchy, but his meteoric rise and evident talent made it clear that he was destined for significant success. His remarkable charisma, combined with his striking appearance, left a strong impression. His arrival sent ripples through the company, especially among the women, from the production plants to the executive suites. In the legal division, where the staff was predominantly female at both clerical and professional levels, his presence caused quite a stir. Rebecca initially ignored the whispers and growing speculations circulating among her colleagues. It wasn't that she was immune to Ethan's charm, but she refused to indulge in idle chatter or let herself be swept away by gossip. Still, as the rumors about Ethan's supposed prowess in the bedroom and his legendary physical attributes grew more exaggerated, she found herself growing curious despite her better judgment. Even so, Rebecca maintained her resolve. She quietly observed her colleagues, including her own secretary, Kara Mitchell, blatantly flirting with Ethan. But Rebecca refused to stoop to such behavior. She was, after all, an attorney, highly professional, composed, and, most importantly, a married woman. Rebecca's life was neatly ordered. She and her husband, Mark, had worked hard to establish themselves. They lived in a charming colonial-style home in Del Mar, conveniently located near the elementary school, a practical step in preparation for the family they planned to start. Rebecca had always been meticulous about planning, and starting a family was no exception. She'd saved diligently for the expenses that came with raising children. Every stage of her life had been carefully calculated, from marrying Mark right after college to pursuing law school. Her marriage to Mark, while seemingly rushed to some, was a deliberate choice. Mark, a middle school science teacher, had put his dreams of becoming a marine biologist on hold to support Rebecca's law school journey. He had always envisioned a life on a boat in a warmer climate, an idealistic dream that Rebecca admired but knew wasn't practical. Over time, Mark grew to love teaching, and in the last 2 years, he had even returned to graduate school during evenings and summers. Their combined incomes placed them in a strong financial position, ready to welcome children into their lives. Mark's dream of marine biology remained just that, a dream, anchored firmly in their reality by the shores of the Hudson River. Their lives had one delightful surprise, however: Max, their dog. Max came into their lives when Mark took his science class to an animal shelter on a school trip. There, he discovered a scruffy, awkward puppy with an ungainly mix of Irish Wolfhound and St. Bernard. While others might have overlooked the pup, Mark, ever the romantic, couldn't resist its soulful brown eyes. He brought Max home, despite Rebecca's initial reservations. To her, the dog seemed a minor consolation for Mark's unfulfilled dream. Max quickly grew into a massive, oddly shaped creature who intimidated visitors at first glance. But behind his imposing appearance was a gentle, affectionate soul whose greatest threat was smothering people with love. Over time, Rebecca found herself cherishing Max nearly as much as she loved Mark. Together, her husband and their enormous dog formed a pair of goofy, lovable companions who brought warmth to her orderly life. Rebecca's life seemed perfect: a house, a loving husband, a loyal dog, and the promise of children. But everything began to change when Ethan Reed set his sights on her. Rebecca Lane was precisely the kind of woman who appealed to Ethan Reed, a stunningly pretty girl evolving into an even more captivating woman. She hadn't yet shed the quiet timidity of her younger years, and her face still held a softness and innocence that echoed that of a young bride. But what truly made her irresistible to Ethan was her ability to keep herself at a distance. For a man accustomed to effortless victories with women, the ones who presented a challenge always became the most desirable. One afternoon, Ethan walked into Rebecca's office, breaking her usual flow of work. "We need to address the triplet leases in the town of Colony," he announced smoothly, stepping closer to her desk. As he leaned over her chair, his arm draped casually over its back, and with his other hand, he gestured toward the spreadsheet he had placed in front of her. The proximity between them was almost tangible, his presence engulfing her, as though he were testing her boundaries without even saying a word. The issue at hand was serious. GE Real Property Division had a long track record of aggressively contesting property taxes, but Colony was no easy adversary. Decades of commercial expansion had made the town skilled at defending its assessments. "What do you suggest?" Rebecca asked, turning her chair slightly to face him. The movement brought her nearly into the circle of his arms, close enough to feel the faint heat radiating from him. There was an undeniable pull in the air between them, a quiet tension that both unnerved and excited her. Ethan locked his gaze on hers, his voice steady and deliberate. "I propose that we file in rem proceedings on every property assessment under those leases." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, her voice cautious. "All of them?" He didn't flinch, his confidence unwavering. "Yes, every single one. I don't like leaving things unfinished." It was impossible not to catch the double meaning in his words, and it sent a thrill through Rebecca that both frightened and exhilarated her. The magnitude of his proposal loomed over her thoughts, but so did the unspoken intent in his tone. "That's a massive undertaking," she said, doing her best to keep her composure. "The town has a strong defense." Ethan's lips curved into a slight smile, and his voice was firm. "A strong offense can break through even the toughest defense." Rebecca and Ethan began working on the tax cases together. Ethan hired independent appraisers and led the preliminary tax protests, while Rebecca meticulously prepared the in rem petitions. The term, derived from Latin, referred to cases focused solely on the property itself, not a defendant. Essentially, they were asking the court to reassess the town's inflated property values, which were pegged at 150% of their actual worth rather than the legal requirement. The workload was immense, and it kept Ethan in close proximity to Rebecca almost daily. True to his word, he pushed forward with an intense offensive, not just in the courtroom strategy, but in his pursuit of her. Rebecca fought hard against his advances, clinging tightly to her resolve. She had no intention of betraying her husband, Mark, whose love and trust had been the cornerstone of her life. Yet, the pull she felt toward Ethan was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her struggles were made all the more difficult by her inexperience. Rebecca had known only one man in her life, her husband. She had been his first, and he had been hers. Their shared innocence had formed a bond she treasured deeply. In her mind, they were destined to remain faithful to each other, bound by vows and love until the end. But Ethan stirred something dormant in her, a curiosity about what it would be like to be with another man. And it wasn't just any man, it was Ethan, with his reputation for passion and skill. The whispers around the office had reached her ears, including Kara Mitchell, her secretary, who had openly bragged about a 2-month affair with Ethan. Kara had shared salacious details of her tryst with Ethan, recounting it with unrestrained enthusiasm until her husband's suspicions put an abrupt end to the affair. Rebecca wasn't Kara, though. Mark wasn't the jealous or controlling type, but his steadfast love and trust made the idea of infidelity weigh heavily on her conscience. Mark was no slouch in the bedroom, but he was predictable. Above average height, modestly handsome, and average where it mattered most. In terms of character, Mark was a prince, a genuinely good man who had won Rebecca's heart since their first meeting in freshman biology class. They had clicked on every level, and she loved him deeply. But Ethan was inescapably alluring, embodying the kind of raw magnetism that bypassed logic entirely. He was irresistible, and worse still, Rebecca knew deep down she didn't want to resist. Ethan's relentless charm showed itself in small, calculated ways. He never missed an opportunity to compliment Rebecca Lane. Her hair, her shoes, her dresses, even the smallest details like a delicate piece of jewelry or a subtle pop of color in her outfit. If Rebecca had been honest with herself, she would have realized that from almost the very first moment Ethan appeared at the GE offices, her behavior and wardrobe had begun to shift. She gradually stopped wearing pants to work. Her once conservative pinstriped lawyer suits gave way to form-fitting skirts paired with matching jackets, each hemline inching higher and tighter as the seasons changed. Even the way she styled her hair and chose her perfume evolved, becoming softer and more alluring. The utilitarian pantyhose she had always worn were replaced by lacy stockings that whispered of femininity and flirtation. Outwardly, Rebecca maintained her image as the restrained, no-nonsense lawyer, but inside, the sensual woman she had kept tightly bound was straining to break free. And Ethan? He had an uncanny ability to loosen those laces. It began innocently enough. Ethan suggested a working lunch at an off-campus location where they wouldn't be interrupted. That lunch eventually became a casual after-work drink. Just one, he assured her, with his disarming smile. You've earned it. But one drink turned into late evenings, and late evenings turned into delayed returns home. At first, Mark would be waiting for her, accompanied by their ever-loyal dog, Max. But as the summer gave way to fall, Mark began spending more time pursuing his own hobbies. He had rekindled his passion for sailing, starting with a small sunfish he had learned to navigate on Lake George. Eventually, he found a part-time job at the Albany Yacht Club, earning a modest wage, but keeping some fragment of his dream alive. Rebecca rationalized that Mark's absences balanced her own. After all, his sailing work contributed to the baby fund they had been building for years, a shared dream of starting a family. But Max, ever the observant canine, was always there to greet her when she came home late. Sometimes his eyes seemed to hold a question, or was it judgment? Rebecca often wondered if Max could sense her inner turmoil, the way she teetered dangerously close to the edge of a precipice she had never intended to approach. And if Mark suspected anything, he gave no indication, choosing instead to turn a blind eye. By the time New York's long, brutal winter began, everything seemed to be building toward an inevitable climax. The October ice storm arrived with a vengeance, casting a heavy veil of icy rain across roads, trees, and power lines. On that particular day, Mark was already feeling worn down. He didn't hate his job as a teacher. Far from it. He actually appreciated the challenge, despite how demanding and often thankless it was. Teaching, Mark often mused, was far more complex than outsiders realized. It wasn't just about instructing students. It was about navigating a labyrinth of obstacles. He had to appease clueless administrators while still finding ways to effectively teach. He had to carefully sidestep the petty dramas of his fellow teachers and their endless grievances. Parents, too, presented challenges. Some smothered their children with attention, while others seemed to forget they had kids at all. There was never a middle ground. And then there were the students themselves. Every day, 3 classes of 9th grade general science, each with 26 students, shuffled through his classroom. That made for 78 teenagers, most of whom were utterly uninterested in understanding the world around them. They cared more about social cliques, their favorite celebrities, and how they looked in the eyes of their peers. Mark had an easier job than the English or social studies teachers. Science, after all, could occasionally spark curiosity. A small explosion or a flashy experiment could grab their attention. But keeping it? That was the real battle. Despite the frustrations, Mark loved his work because he understood its importance. Science wasn't just a subject. It was a framework for understanding the universe. Ignorance of it, he feared, could lead to disastrous consequences for society. Yet his sense of purpose was constantly undermined by short-sighted administrators, indifferent politicians, and a culture that reduced his work to nothing more than preparing students for meaningless standardized tests. It was a job you could easily hate, but Mark had found a way to embrace it. Still, days like this one, a cold, miserable day layered with icy weather and a bitter sense of monotony, tested his resolve. By noon, a state of emergency had been declared, closing schools and most businesses. He wondered briefly how Rebecca's car, an Audi that wasn't exactly built for icy conditions, would manage the slick roads. Mark knew that Rebecca's Audi wasn't made for weather like this, so he decided to take his old diesel Ford pickup and drive her home himself. The Audi could sit safely in the company lot overnight, and he'd bring her back to work the next day. He figured it was the least he could do to make sure she stayed safe on the treacherous roads. By mid-afternoon, Mark pulled into the GE campus in Schenectady. He expected he'd have to drag Rebecca out of her office early, but to his surprise, the lot was nearly empty. As he scanned the area, he saw her exiting the building, but she wasn't alone. Walking beside Rebecca was a tall man holding an umbrella. His arm was casually draped around her waist as they walked together, their movements fluid and unhurried. The familiarity in their body language struck Mark immediately. It wasn't the kind of closeness shared by two co-workers simply sheltering from the rain. There was something undeniably intimate about the way they moved. Mark experienced a moment of clarity, like a light bulb switching on in the mind of a struggling student who suddenly understands a difficult lesson. He realized all at once the meaning of the subtle changes he'd noticed in Rebecca over the past months. The way she had started dressing differently, the vague distraction in her manner at home, and her repeated late arrivals. The signs had been there all along, but his love and trust had blinded him to their meaning. Until now. As the couple approached a patch of icy pavement, Rebecca leaned into the man, resting her head briefly against his chest and wrapping an arm around him. To an outsider, it might have seemed like the prudent move of a woman trying to steady herself on slippery ground. But to Mark, it was too natural, too comfortable. There was no hesitation in her movements, no sense of self-consciousness. She wasn't just a married woman relying on someone for balance. She was leaning into someone who clearly wasn't her husband. Mark's first impulse was to turn his truck around and drive away. But that wasn't who he was. Instead, he drove forward, his old pickup slowly closing the distance until it blocked their path to the parking lot entrance. Rebecca and the man looked up in surprise. The man, who Mark now knew must be Ethan Reed, looked like he was about to curse him out but stopped when Mark rolled down the window. "I thought my wife could use a lift home," Mark said, his voice cutting through the freezing rain. Ethan's expression shifted, the angry words clearly swallowed back down. Rebecca, however, froze in place, her mouth falling open in shock. Mark leaned farther out of the window, letting the icy rain hit his face as he locked eyes with her. His voice was steady, but carried a sharp edge. "Get in." Rebecca hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling away from Ethan and hurrying around the truck to open the passenger door. She climbed in, her movements stiff and unsteady. Mark watched Ethan as she did, fixing him with a hard stare. Ethan's attempted smile was weak and unconvincing, and Mark didn't return it. With Rebecca seated firmly in the truck, Mark gave Ethan a single, curt nod before shifting the truck into gear and driving off. The trip to their home in Del Mar usually took 30 minutes, but with the icy roads, it stretched into over an hour. To Mark, the silence in the truck's cab made the journey feel much longer. Neither of them spoke until they turned onto the bypass in Bethlehem, mere moments from home. Finally, Mark broke the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. "Were you ever going to tell me about him?" Rebecca continued staring out the passenger window, refusing to meet his gaze. For a moment, she considered lying, but dismissed the thought. There was nothing to deny. "Not really." "No," she said quietly, "because there's nothing to tell. Ethan is a coworker. I like him, and he likes me." Mark's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "You get that close to all your work friends?" Rebecca hesitated, then sighed. "No, of course not," she admitted before adding, after a pause. "Ethan is something special to me. We're close in a way that's more than just friendship." Mark said nothing for a long moment, turning onto Delaware Avenue as they neared their modest three-bedroom colonial house. Her words swirled in his mind as he fought to process their meaning. Finally, he spoke again, his tone sharp. "Just how far has this friendship gone with Mr. Umbrella?" Rebecca turned toward him then, her expression defiant but tired. "His name is Ethan. Ethan Reed. He works in the real property office. He's just..." A co-worker, Mark said, lacing his words with such biting sarcasm that his disbelief was palpable. By this time, they had reached their driveway, and before addressing Mark's accusation, Rebecca hopped out of the truck and rushed into the house. Mark pulled his old Ford into the garage, pausing to steady himself before following her inside. By the time he walked through the side door into the kitchen, Rebecca was already upstairs in the master bedroom. Max, their ever-loyal dog, waited just inside the kitchen, ready for his evening walk. Despite the miserable weather, Mark clipped on Max's leash, and the two headed out. The icy rain didn't faze Max. He seemed almost designed for such challenges. They made their way to the elementary school's open playing fields, now eerily empty in the freezing downpour. By the time they returned home, both were drenched. Mark led Max into the basement, where he peeled off his wet clothes and tossed them into the washer. He grabbed clean clothes from the dryer while Max shook himself off, droplets flying everywhere. Smiling faintly, Mark grabbed an old beach towel to help dry the big dog. It was a quiet, comforting routine, one that gave him time to think. When they returned upstairs, Rebecca was waiting in the kitchen. She was wrapped in a terry cloth robe, a half-empty bottle of wine on the table in front of her. 2 glasses sat beside it. "We need to talk," she said, her tone steady as she poured wine into both glasses. Mark took a seat at the table, deliberately choosing the end rather than sitting across from her. It gave him an angle to avoid her direct gaze while still keeping her in view. He turned slightly, keeping his expression unreadable. Rebecca's voice softened, almost tender, but there was an undercurrent of resolve. "I want you to know that I love you, and I'm very happy in our marriage," she began. "But while nothing romantic has happened with Ethan, it's fair to say there's a strong attraction between us." Mark's jaw tightened, his hands gripping his glass of wine. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice low, but filled with simmering anger. It wasn't just jealousy fueling his emotions. It was a deep sense of betrayal. Rebecca had been his first and only love. Their relationship was his foundation, the one constant in his life. Rebecca hesitated, carefully choosing her words. She was a lawyer, after all, someone who assembled language with precision. "It means that we have a strong marriage, and I'm fully committed to it," she said. "I love you, Mark, but I'm also a woman, and I can't control every thought or feeling I have. I'm attracted to Ethan. I can't deny that, but I've never been with another man besides you. That's the truth." Mark turned slightly, his voice sharpening. "And you think that justifies this? That makes it okay?" Rebecca sighed, visibly conflicted. "No, it's not about justification. It's about honesty. I'm tempted by him. Yes, but I haven't acted on it. I haven't even kissed him. And I won't. Unless—" Her voice trailed off, the word hanging in the air like a heavy stone. Mark stood abruptly, cutting her off before she could continue. "Max needs feeding," he said, his tone clipped and cold. Rebecca let the conversation drop, her thoughts spinning. She was caught between her love for Mark and the undeniable desire she felt. The weeks after that icy October day were strained. The temperature outside gradually warmed, but between Rebecca and Mark, the chill lingered. They spoke only in passing, their once warm connection replaced with a brittle tension. When Rebecca returned to work after the storm, Ethan cornered her with questions. "What happened with your husband? He wasn't violent, was he?" asked. "No," Rebecca replied, brushing past him. "He was shocked and hurt. I heard him." "Well, he sure looked like he wanted to kill someone," Ethan muttered. Rebecca shook her head, her expression guarded. "Mark's not like that. He's just hurt. That's all." Thanksgiving came and went with little fanfare. By December, the holidays loomed, and the annual office party provided a brief escape from the tension at home. It was a small affair, with little in the way of excitement or alcohol. Most employees made quick appearances before heading out. By then, Ethan Reed had already charmed his way through the majority of the attractive women at GSKC, leaving no complaints in his wake. The only exception to his conquest was Rebecca, though his interest in her hadn't waned. Since Mark's unexpected appearance in October, Rebecca had kept her distance. But time softened the edges of her resolve, and Ethan knew how to bide his time. As the office party wound down, Ethan managed to intercept Rebecca just outside her office. Before she knew it, they were inside, the door closed behind them, and his lips were on hers. "I can't," she said, pulling away. "Why not?" Ethan pressed, his voice low. "You said your husband wouldn't cause trouble." "It's still cheating," Rebecca replied, her voice trembling. "I owe Mark better than that." Ethan leaned closer, his voice insistent. "What do you owe yourself, Rebecca? You know what you want. Stop denying it." Rebecca fought the pull, but when Ethan embraced her, her resistance faltered. Her kiss was fiery, filled with all the passion she had tried to suppress. It took every ounce of willpower to break away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears in her eyes. Ethan sighed, frustrated. "Well, I guess we're almost out of time." "What do you mean?" she asked, confused. "I'm being promoted. Transferred to the New York City headquarters. I'll be gone by the end of January," he explained. Rebecca blinked, stunned. "They haven't announced that yet." "They will after the new year," Ethan said. "But I've already been told to start preparing." He kissed her again, but this time Rebecca didn't return it. On her drive home, her thoughts swirled. Ethan's imminent departure gave her a sense of relief, but also of regret. She didn't want a future with him, but the idea of missing this one opportunity gnawed at her. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Rebecca had convinced herself that she needed to talk to Mark. She wasn't going to cheat. Instead, she would explain her feelings and try to reach a mutual understanding. Though, deep down, she knew she was shaping the conversation to get what she wanted. Rebecca chose Sunday evening after dinner as the right moment. She made Mark's favorite pot roast, primping herself up afterward. Around 9 p.m., she slipped onto the couch next to him, her perfume faint but noticeable. Mark turned to her, catching the scent, just as she placed a soft kiss on his lips. Rebecca then pulled back slightly and said, "I want to talk about the problem that's come between us." Mark's brow furrowed. "Problem?" he asked cautiously. "My attraction to Ethan Reed," she said plainly. Mark leaned back, his expression darkening. "Ethan? You mean Mr. Umbrella from the parking lot?" "Yes," Rebecca admitted. "The man from the parking lot. I'm attracted to him." Mark's jaw tightened, and his entire body tensed. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "It means he wants me," she said, hesitating before adding. "And I want him." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He instinctively pulled away, but Rebecca leaned closer, pressing her body against his and resting her head on his chest. She took his hands in hers, trying to keep him from retreating further. "It doesn't change how I feel about you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I love you. I'll always love you. I just want him right now. Physically. It's nothing more than that." Mark wasn't having it. He gently but firmly pushed her back, holding her at arm's length so he could look her directly in the eyes. His voice was calm, but it carried a sharp edge of disbelief and hurt. "Rebecca, what are you trying to tell me? Have you already slept with him? Because this isn't what a wife says to her husband unless she's confessing something." She smiled faintly, a weak attempt at reassurance, and met his gaze. "I would never do that," she said softly. "Not without telling you first." "So, you're telling me now?" Mark pressed, his voice rising slightly. Rebecca nodded, steeling herself. "I'm telling you that I want this. Just once. Before we have kids, before we settle down completely." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "We've saved enough. We're ready to start a family, but we've been waiting. I've been waiting, and now I know why." "And why is that?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with dread. "Because I've never been with anyone else," Rebecca confessed. "I've only ever been with you, Mark. When I was younger, I was so focused, so controlled. I never allowed myself to experience life. I never let myself explore or take risks. Now I just want this one thing. One brief experience before we settle into what I know will be a wonderful life together. A great marriage and a beautiful family. I need this one fling to feel like I've lived fully." Mark stared at her. Disbelief etched across his face. "You want to have an affair with Mr. Umbrella?" he all but shouted. "No," Rebecca countered, her voice sharp. "Not an affair. Just one encounter. He's leaving for New York City after the new year. I want one weekend with him. Nothing more." Mark's voice dropped, low and menacing. "And if I say no?" Rebecca's confidence faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "I was hoping you'd understand that I need this," she said, her tone softer now, almost pleading. Before he could respond, she leaned in and kissed him, trying to dissolve his resistance with affection. Their lovemaking that night was bittersweet, marked by an unspoken awareness that something between them had shifted irreparably. To Rebecca, the matter felt settled. She informed Ethan that the first weekend in January would be his. When the weekend arrived, Rebecca drove her Audi to Ethan's modest three-bedroom, split-level home in Niskayuna. It stood out in a neighborhood filled with grander, five-bedroom colonial houses. As agreed, Ethan had left his garage door open for her. She parked next to his sleek Porsche and stepped into the house. Ethan greeted her in the living room, a bottle of wine already open on the coffee table. From her vantage point on the steps leading from the garage entry to the main floor, he had a full view of her figure as she descended. She had chosen a short black dress that hugged her curves, accentuating her full chest and the graceful line of her hips. The look of lust and anticipation in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. It was so different from the expression Mark had worn when she left him barely 20 minutes earlier. Mark's eyes had been filled with sadness, a raw, unspoken pain that Rebecca wished she could erase. But she had convinced herself that this was the right choice. This was a one-time adventure, she had told him. After this, she would be his forever. They would build their family, strengthen their marriage, and prove that their love could survive this. She truly believed it. As she stepped into the living room, her body tingled with anticipation. Ethan approached her, and their bodies seemed to move toward each other naturally, as if drawn by an invisible force. Their embrace was immediate, his arms wrapping around her as he kissed her deeply. She returned the kiss, her passion finally unleashed after weeks of restraint. Ethan pulled back slightly, his voice smooth and teasing. "One glass of wine," he said, gesturing to the bottle. "Then we're off to dinner. I've got reservations and tickets for the show after." Ethan Reed knew how to savor his prize. For the weekend, Rebecca Lane had given herself completely to him, and he relished the opportunity to wine, dine, and impress her. They had dinner at an elegant Italian restaurant in downtown Schenectady, followed by a show at the newly renovated vaudeville theater, Proctor's Musical Hall. They drank little, but shared champagne when they returned to his home, toasting to a weekend of unrestrained indulgence. In the bedroom, Ethan treated Rebecca like a masterpiece to be unwrapped and admired. His words, soft and appreciative, made her feel more beautiful than she ever had before. For the first time, she felt completely seen and desired, as his hands explored her body with reverence and skill. She let herself sink into the moment, pushing away the lingering thoughts of Mark, her husband, her anchor, determined to dedicate this time to her desires alone. But as their passion crescendoed, Rebecca realized with a sudden jolt that they hadn't used any extra precautions. While she was still on the pill, the oversight left her unsure whether to feel relieved or conflicted. She quickly pushed the thought aside. This weekend wasn't about practicality. It was about experiencing what she had craved. For 2 days, they existed in a bubble. The intimacy was exhilarating, and Ethan's inventiveness left Rebecca feeling fulfilled in ways she hadn't thought possible. By Sunday evening, though, reality crept in. She was ready to return home and restore her life with Mark. After sharing a final meal of Chinese takeout, they indulged one last time before Rebecca showered, dressed, and left Ethan's house the same way she had arrived, through the garage, avoiding the gaze of nosy neighbors. Rebecca convinced herself that her marriage would emerge stronger from this, that her fleeting affair would have no lasting impact. She pulled into her driveway 20 minutes later, her thoughts full of plans to reconcile with Mark and move forward together. But the house was dark. The porch lights were off, and Mark's truck was nowhere in sight. Assuming he had parked in the garage, Rebecca entered through the side door, expecting Max, their loyal dog, to greet her. The silence was unnerving. She called out, "I'm home," but no dog appeared, and the house remained still. She poured herself a glass of scotch and settled onto the couch, convincing herself Mark had gone for a late walk. Exhausted, Rebecca eventually dozed off, only to be startled awake hours later by the doorbell. Morning light streamed through the windows, and Rebecca, disoriented, realized something was wrong. Max wasn't at the door, his usual spot. When she opened the door, a woman with tightly pulled-back hair and a dark, ill-fitting pantsuit stood on the step. "Rebecca Lane?" the woman asked. "Yes," Rebecca replied cautiously. "Mrs. Mark Lane?" the woman clarified. "Yes." "What is this about?" Rebecca asked. "I'm Detective Emma Grant," the woman said, flashing a badge. "May I come in? I need to ask you some questions." Rebecca stepped back automatically, letting the detective enter. A chill ran through her as she asked, "Did something happen to Mark?" "Not that I'm aware of," Detective Grant replied. "I'm here about Ethan Reed." Rebecca's stomach dropped. "What about him?" she asked, her voice unsteady. The detective flipped open her notepad. "He was attacked last night while taking his trash out. He claims he was jumped by a man in a ski mask wielding a small club." Rebecca gasped. "You're here because you think Mark—" "Actually, no," Grant interrupted, a faint smile crossing her face. "Mark Lane has been cleared. He was our first thought, of course, especially since Mr. Reed told us he spent the weekend with you." Rebecca paled, sinking onto the couch. The detective continued. "Mark launched his boat, the Amore, from the Albany Yacht Club yesterday afternoon. The staff tracked him via radio. He was near Poughkeepsie at the time of the attack." Rebecca stared blankly. "Boat? He went out on the river in January?" Grant nodded. "A 38-foot Catalina, purchased last month. Apparently, he's heading south. The yacht club manager said it's lucky the river isn't iced over this year." Rebecca bolted upstairs to the master bedroom. At first, everything seemed untouched, but when she opened Mark's dresser, it was nearly empty. On her own dresser, she found a sealed greeting card with a handwritten note inside. "Dear Rebecca, I've accepted a job in Florida with a small marine research institute. It's an entry-level position, but it's a start. I'm sorry to leave like this, but I couldn't stay in this marriage any longer. I think you were right. We should experience life before settling down. I'll miss you, but I'm not sure I love you anymore. I've taken the baby fund to buy a boat. Do what you want at the house and the divorce. I hope things work out with Ethan. Goodbye. Mark." Rebecca collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Detective Grant found her moments later and helped her to the bed. Despite her own lack of sympathy for women who betrayed their spouses, the detective couldn't help but offer some compassion. "Let me make you some tea," she said gently. Rebecca shook her head. "No, I'll be fine. Let's go back downstairs. I'll answer your questions." Detective Grant asked about Ryan Mitchell, the husband of Rebecca's secretary, Kara. Rebecca insisted she'd never seen him before, even when shown a mugshot. Grant sighed. "He's a likely suspect. He has a record for assault and a history of jealousy. If I could place him near the scene, I might break his alibi. But without that," Rebecca asked quietly, "will Ethan be okay?" "He's in the hospital," Grant said. "He was beaten badly, especially in the sensitive areas. I'd wait a few days before visiting him." Rebecca nodded, her mind spinning. "I can't see him right now. I need to find my husband and fix this." Grant's expression was skeptical. "That may be difficult. By now, he's probably passing the George Washington Bridge." In fact, by the time Grant left, Mark and Max had already sailed past the Statue of Liberty and out of New York Harbor. With a starboard turn, Mark pointed the Amore south by southeast, leaving behind the city, his marriage, and his past.